Welcome everyone to Sound4Church 1.0, and my name is Oluwaferanmi Makinde, and I'm the creative lead of Fklef Productions, and I'm also the facilitator for Sound4Church. And I have here with me tonight Marco. Marco is a system integrator, live sound engineer, and he's also privileged to be the audio lead for 2819 Church, which is one of the churches with the best production in the US. Like best production when it comes to sound, music, and entire production. And tonight we'll be walking you through everything that would help you to become more confident with operating and understanding your sound system in church, and gonna take you through the process and the mindset as well. So make sure you have your jotting materials, you have your notes and iPad to note things down. And at the end of this session, we're going to have a Q&A session.
Cool. Hey, I'm gonna take the opportunity real quick. I think most of us that are here are in church, so it feels fitting to open this with prayer real quick. So we're gonna start with that. Father, thank you for the opportunity for us to get together to learn more about sound, to help bring excellence to our churches. Thank you for the opportunity to work with Farron on this together, and pray that you would just speak through us, help us have the right words to say, and be able to bring some knowledge and helpful information to the people on this webinar. And we lift all this up in Jesus' name. Amen.
Okay, Marco, over to you with consultation.
Yeah. So we're kind of going to break this down into 5 sections. And the first section, I want to talk about consultation. I would say that it's probably a really wise starting point to have an independent consultant come in and talk with your church, if there's something that's possible for the church, because we've seen a lot of churches kind of misspend funds, or have different conversations with different people. And I love the joke of you can put 4 sound guys in a room and there's going to be 10 ways to do a sound, and all of those 10 ways are the right way. And the hope would be that if you have a good consultant that's near you, that they're well experienced and can kind of help lend themselves to the situation with giving you some kind of like more high level information instead of just one person's individual perspective. At least for the consultants that I've also talked with and worked with, we all try to kind of stay unbiased and not really be so brand specific. So anyways, kind of talking through the role of a consultant, and how that would operate. In the US specifically, there's a lot of like consulting groups or independent system analysts that would kind of exist to help serve like what is the vision for a church purchase. And we're talking mostly not in the sense of like, hey, we need to buy a new microphone or we need to, like small stuff. We're talking like larger kind of large picture purchases. So like doing a console upgrade or a new wireless system, or especially PA and acoustics. There's a lot of kind of the things that we're going to talk about in regards to this area. So with that section of consultation, I think one of the first questions would be, what should you consider before making a purchase with your church? And this will be a good way to kind of set up some of the things that you might want to talk to with a consultant. A couple main points that I would think through just from my personal experience, and I'll take a tangent here to say there's a lot of different size churches in the US. I'm blessed with the opportunity that the 2 churches I'm working with are a larger room, so we kind of have the capacity to do some things because of the size of the room. But I realize that because we're in some of these smaller spaces around the US as well, like not everything that would be applicable to what I'm personally doing isn't going to work in all spaces. So I'm going to try to address most of today for like the average like 200 to 500 seat church kind of size congregations and rooms, and kind of lead from that and not so much from like the large scale, more touring focused kind of larger rooms, which are great, but I think that's like a 10 or 15% kind of space. So anyways, a couple of those questions that I would ask as an independent consultant would be, what is your worship culture currently for the church? You know, are there specific elements that are really important to the service? Are there things that would like play into like certain necessities for your sound system, or like very specific design criteria that you might want to think through? And that can be helpful, having an outside person who hasn't been in your space come in and just kind of give a fresh set of eyes to say, hey, I see this thing that you're doing on your services, maybe from your YouTube, or if they attend a service. I always encourage people to, come and attend a service before trying to do a large upgrade or something. And so that would be a first question. Second question would be, what is the congregation and the room size? Are there multiple services? Are you guys kind of at the capacity of the space? Sometimes, like, I've had some conversations with people where they are looking to upgrade a sound system, and it's like, hey, really the right conversation would be, let's make this work for another 6 months, and they're looking to upgrade to a bigger space, or something like that. A couple other questions would be, what is the service programming content? Is this like traditional music based, or is this like more louder kind of worship gospel stuff? Because that will kind of play into some different design elements. And then, is there like an overall budget that has already been decided by leadership? Because, that's something that should be kept in mind as well, to not like, hey, we'd all love to have the biggest and greatest systems and all the things, but sometimes we could be chasing a solution that's like so far out of budget and what the vision is for leadership or a pastor. And so I think those are, if you can get ahead of those conversations, those are some big things that I try to look for at first.
Yep. So thank you. And my very first question for you tonight is going to be like, what is the role of an audio consultant, and how do you function in the role of an audio consultant, and how does it apply to like a church settings? What is the importance of like having an audio consultant in the church settings?
Yeah, so I think the thing that, like I was kind of saying before, that a consultant can kind of add to the equation is, there's somebody who is not biased. I think a good consultant, like not being on staff with a church, maybe not attending there for 15 years. I know there's, I don't want to step on people's toes, but there might be some volunteers, who are involved, who have been serving faithfully and really like matter to the church and are a large part of what the church is doing, but they might only have one perspective because maybe that's the only church they've worked in. And like, that's still valuable information to have, but someone else coming in as an outside consultant could be like, oh, hey, you have these great things you're doing, but did you know that this product exists that would allow you to like facilitate your vision and accomplish those needs better? So I think that's one thing. Also, some of the consultants that I've talked with that work in system design especially are kind of going, okay, what's the right system for the room? I'm not wearing a specific vendor shirt today. So, there's lots of great PAs, there's lots of great consoles, there's some consoles and some PAs that could use some work. But we're not going to get really heavy on brand stuff. It's more just trying to look holistically as like, hey, is this the right solution for a space? Or there's some other things that maybe should be worked on or adjusted. So anyways, that's kind of my initial response.
All right, good. And furthermore, what should you consider before making a purchase for your church sound system as a volunteer or as a pastor? Like, what should you consider before like making decision on what to go for your church PA system?
And can you ask, like, I'm trying to think, the question from which perspective?
Okay. So what do you consider before even thinking of making purchase? Like, what are some of the things you need to look out for? Let's say we're starting a church and we need to make purchase for sound system. What do we need to look out for? Is it the venue is it the size of the church? Is it the kind of music we do? Is it like the budget, or like is it just like going for what everyone else is going for around the community?
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah, I think like some things that I would be looking at is, what are the room acoustics like? What is the size of the room? different people who will prefer different kind of speaker systems to be installed. And I would kind of counter a lot of that by, hey, what is the pastor or the executive team or the worship lead team, what is their vision for worship and for the message that's being preached? Like, do they want technology to get out of the way? There's some people that, I've worked with churches, and it's really cool sometimes to work with someone where they're like, hey, we don't want to see the PA. And so you start getting into either flying stuff way high out of like the main visual space, or sometimes if it's a smaller room, looking at like a column speaker system that can be mounted on the walls and it doesn't detract from the space. Maybe there's a big open ceiling, or there's a stained glass window, or other elements that, need to be kind of designed and thought around. And I've come into some spaces where it's like, well, somebody just kind of threw a system in because it was a time constraint or a budget constraint. And I was like, well, if somebody could have sat and thought on this a little bit longer and had some more conversations, there might have been a better way to approach this, right?
Okay, so how do you place the balance between the pastor's vision and what is technically right?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think the thing that I would probably try to lean towards is, hey, at the end of the day, especially if you're a volunteer or you're on staff, like at the end of the day, you submit to the pastor's leadership. They're responsible for shepherding the congregation and the church, right? And their executive team. If you disagree with your pastor, that's okay. I think there's healthy ways to have those conversations, right? And I've never worked in a church environment where if you have the conversation the right way, I would approach it as, hey, I'm struggling to achieve what your vision is. Can you bring clarity to that so that I can serve you the best I can? That's going to be taken way better, or, saying, hey, can I help educate you on some things that I'm perceiving, instead of just, no, that's not the right way to do it. We're not, like, that's very dismissive, And I mean, I've had those, like, even with my pastor. I just talked with him Sunday between services because I was like, hey, I'm seeing some communication from you on stage. I want to make sure that I'm understanding your communication well so that I can respond and give you what you're looking for. And he was like, hey, great, thanks. Thank you for bringing that to me. So, I mean, I've not personally been in a church environment where that was ever like not received well from leadership or from a pastor. Because again, I think if you can approach that as, hey, I'm trying to serve your vision and what you're looking for. And again, if maybe their vision is not to have very loud concert style worship, and just because you'd like it to sound that way, like if that's not what the worship culture or the vision of the church is, like you have to submit to that leadership, at the end of the day.
Okay, so in the order of importance, so it's safe to say the pastor's vision is the most important thing in this structure.
I would say so. I think that I've seen churches approach that the wrong way from some churches that I've been in.
Because my concern also is that sometimes pastors don't have accurate, technical knowledge.
Yeah, and
so,
I think
the idea
that's
might
where,
be out of date.
Right. Yeah, and I think that's a great point. Like, that's where I would go, hey, are there some churches that you've been to that you were really happy with how the sound was, or was there a conference maybe that you were at? It's like, okay, what were the key points that you liked about that? And do those align with what the vision of the church is, right? Because I know, like, I've seen pastors that will come back from a conference and they're like, oh, I just wish we had this and this. And it's like, that's great, but maybe the church doesn't have the load capacity in the ceiling to do this kind of a PA or this kind of an LED wall or whatever that might look like. So I'm getting way deep in the weeds on this, but I mean, I think at the end of the day, you still need to submit to what your pastor's vision is. But I think you can raise that bar of excellence, right, by bringing a consultant or another skilled engineer to the table to say, hey, we're noticing these things. We'd like to approach this, and I know we'll kind of get into some more details of this further down in our discussion. But
yep. And I think there is a culture in churches whereby pastors, just go ahead to purchase sound system and without consulting or without informing the volunteers or without informing the operators. Mm-hmm. Do you think it is the right approach? And what do you think should be the right order to it?
Yeah, so, and I mean, that kind of speaks to your question earlier. Like, I think that's a good way to kind of open the conversation of bringing a consultant to the table, especially for, if you're somebody who's serving and you're a volunteer and, you're, maybe this is the first church you've worked in, or it's, somewhere you've been serving for a while, but this is not like your full-time role, whether you're volunteer or contract for the weekend. I think that's a big point where that's where bringing in a consultant that's independent and they're not working for a manufacturer specifically, they're not working for the church. They don't really have a bias one direction or the other, and then they can kind of be that educating partner to go to your pastor or to your leadership and be like, hey, maybe, okay, let's take an example. If the vision is, hey, we'd really like to have a really powerful worship experience in our building, and we want that to be a big thing, but you're clipping the amps for your PA all day, then some people might go, well, we need more channels or we need more XYZ, and look at it as a console thing. And I would go, okay, well, have you reached the physical limits of the PA, or is there some tuning that maybe could be done to work with a system processor and try to open the PA up a little bit more? Maybe it was kind of pulled and reined in a little bit. So anyways, I think there's always some conversations to be had, and that's where a consultant can be valuable in that experience, instead of always feeling like you're fighting an uphill. Basically let the consultant be the in-between person for you to be able to have those conversations between pastoral staff and your production staff, and they can be a good neutral party, in the in-between.
So are you saying the consultant should be the pastor's first point of contact before making decisions when it comes to sound?
I think there's value in that, yeah. I mean, there's some great integrators that I've worked with or that I'm familiar with, and they have design consultants that are on their team. But I think if you have the ability to have an independent consultant come in, at the end of the day, the consultant should be able to steer you towards a good integrator, not steer you away from someone, right? Yeah. There's integrators that I'm partnered with here in Atlanta and in the US that I will send clients to, because I'm like, hey, this person is looking for XYZ. This would be a great integrator for you to work with because of the location or because of their specific expertise in a certain area or whatever. And so that can kind of be that good handoff between an audio system consultant. And this kind of gets into the next thing of where that gap or that handoff is between things, where I don't, as a consultant, usually design a system. I'm kind of there to ask questions and to open the conversations. If I then work as a designer with an integrator, that becomes a different conversation, a different capacity, because I do kind of do both. But there's a lot, this past week, I got brought into a project where basically they've built a new auditorium. Their old auditorium is their student space, and so they're wanting to move the production booth from the balcony down to the floor, close the balcony off, and turn it into classrooms. And so as an independent consultant, I got brought in just to give some kind of balance and perspective to some ways to approach that and some kind of best practices. And actually none of it really dealt with production. It was mostly about entrance and exiting, kind of getting, where do we want to put the doors to the booth, and how much space do we actually need in a new booth on the floor, and things like that. So that's where me coming in, not as a person on staff, not working for an integrator, I don't necessarily have a priority, or not a priority is the right word. I don't have a bias or a preference that's kind of pushing an agenda at all. My thing is just, hey, how do we make this the best win for the church, right? So yeah.
Yep. So that brings me to the next question. Good sound, to achieve good sound in church, is it based on budget?
I don't think so. I've been at great churches that had a really good, affordable system, that was installed well and deployed well and tuned well, and they had good equipment that was being run by good operators, and it sounded way better than some massive churches that I've been in that it just kind of fell flat. That's not always the case. There is good things to be said, for investing in equipment and stuff, but I think the room and the person ultimately can matter more than the equipment. I've seen guys struggle on a Digico, and I've seen guys struggle on an M32, X32 console. So I've heard great and bad mixes on both.
So are you saying a good sound is not based on budget? Because a lot of the big churches, they definitely invest in big gears. So is it safe to assume that the gap between churches that have good productions when it comes to sound and churches that have bad production is not just the budget, or budget also comes into play?
Yeah, I think that has a portion of it, but I don't know that I would say that the budget is the biggest decision factor in that, if that makes sense. I think the budget enables the vision, but I think like having an alignment in the team where everyone together can be agreed upon what is the vision, what are we trying to accomplish with a Sunday service or Sunday gathering, is what we call it for 2819. It's a gathering of believers. We don't call them services. But for the people gathering together to come worship and to come hear the message, what is the vision that we're trying to deliver? Like maybe a concert-sized PA system isn't the right move for the congregation based on the age demographic of the church, right? You might not need things to be that loud. Also, like a big vision thing, I'm not gonna take a 20-minute tangent on this, but like if the drums are in a we call it the fishbowl, but if the drums are caged with an acoustic shield and some baffles and stuff, or if they're a free range drummer, like a free range chicken, if they don't have any isolation on the drums, that becomes a factor in, well, is your vision for loud drums, loud worship, and like that powerful moment, or do we want to control all that energy so that it's not like as overbearing and as loud? And I don't think either one of them is right or wrong. It just is, okay, well, what's the vision of the house? If the vision is for the vocals to be like the loudest and clearest thing, maybe we need to talk about drum isolation. If having a big powerful band mix where the vocals are not sitting really far in front, maybe there's some room if the room is big enough to have the drum. We kind of split that hybrid. We have a shield, but we don't have a top or a back to it. But also the only reason I've kind of been able to get away with that is because the room size is big enough. There's enough air behind it. So if we were in a 400 seat room, we would 100% have to cage the drums just because of the amount of volume coming off of them. So anyways, I don't know if that really answers the question, but.
Okay, so that brings me to my next question. So what makes a good sound? Is it the sound system or the engineer?
I would say my hot take on this, I think the engineer matters more than the system. I've done album recordings that were on 2 QSC K12s, but we had time to deploy the system and to tune the speakers well and make sure that the response coming out of them was the best that it could be. And I've also gone and mixed on massive line arrays in a massive room, and it was not something I was proud of when I left at the end of the day because it was rushed and we didn't have enough time to fully sound check everything. Maybe it was understaffed. But so I would say that I think a good engineer or a volunteer that's been trained well is gonna outrun somebody that has just slamming system but maybe doesn't have the fundamentals down as well, if that makes sense.
That makes sense. I want us to digress a bit into the online sound. What is the best way to get your online sound? Is it getting from the front of house mix or having a dedicated separate mix for the broadcast?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so that's a cool question. There's kind of two ways to split this kind of thought process, I guess. A couple considerations would be, I think you can get a good mix from front of house if the front of house mix is being optimized where the room isn't coloring the mix a ton. And because you can change tonality with EQ, but you can't use EQ to just delete room acoustics if they're bad. There's a point where you can't change the laws of physics. So an example would be if it's a really bright sounding room, let's say there's a lot of drywall reflections that are happening and everything's kind of going to sound very high mid heavy, well then you might end up EQing a lot of that out of the channels or out of the PA, And so then if you took the same mix that you were sending to the PA and listened to it in a car or on headphones, everything's going to sound really dull because you've cut all that energy out.
True.
So with that, kind of guardrails for perspective in mind, if you can treat the room and get the room where the mix that you're presenting is replicating the same, like consistently in the room and on some headphones or an online thing, then I think that opens up the conversation for, like, the way I would approach that. For example, let's say we had an Avantis or an M32. Usually there's a couple matrices on the console, and so you could send a PA matrix, and you could also have a record matrix that you can add some room mics or some audience mics to. If you want to take that a step further, you could handle some of the time delay stuff or some tonal differences that are happening. But I've done that for people. There's a church we installed a system at, and they went from mixing separately online to mixing just from the console at front of house with a matrix feed with adding the audience mics. And so I don't think that inherently either one of them is bad. What I would probably balance that secondly with is if you're in a smaller room and you're basically mixing for the room instead of mixing like a full presented product. What I mean by that is, like, if you have a lot of drum bleed, for example, your mix might have a lot of sub information to kind of keep up with the bleed of the drums, but maybe not a lot of the snare and cymbals and tom mics, and you might have the vocals more forward than you would need them to be in an online mix. So like those kinds of things start being a bigger thing to figure out how to balance, so something like that, I might say, hey, if it's possible to have a second console that's isolated in a different room, I think that's going to give you a better result. But then again, I've seen churches that are mixing from just one console and hitting a matrix with some processing on it or something, and it sounds great. So I think both of them can be a win. I think it goes back to the previous conversation of what's the vision. If we're looking for like an album quality sound online, probably going to end up needing another console or some substantial processing to happen. But if the online mix is basically just intending to be kind of like a window into what's happening in the room, maybe there's not multiple campuses that are watching or something like that, then I don't know if I would want to assign as much resources to that, instead of, hey, are there other things that we could prioritize resources for the year towards? So I don't know if that completely answers the question.
I think that also takes us back to the vision of the church and the vision of the pastor. Because some churches definitely doesn't prioritize the online. The focus is the people in the room. So for such churches, I think it's wise to just focus more on the people in the room. And some churches actually like prioritize more like for online sound, much more than the people in the room. For such people, if they have the budget, it's always better to get separate mixing desk.
Yep. Yeah, and I think, that keys up a good point. Like, I guess another way you could answer this question would be, like, I don't think that budget always has to prohibit you from having a good online mix. There's been a lot of times, we're not going to call anyone out, I'm just talking through simple workflow on a console, but let's take an M32. They're pretty prevalent in the US, I would imagine. Around the UK, there's probably X32, M32s around a lot. There's 6 matrices on it. So a normal deployment for me, for example, would be the main left-right bus, and then matrix 1, 2 is linked, that's your PA left-right. If I can go into a processor, I'll let that do all of the zones, and I'll just send a full range left-right. And then maybe there's a lobby feed, and then matrix 5, 6 will be my broadcast feed, and you can go fade or flip into that and add the audience mics only to that matrix. And you can even set them to be post fade so that you could ride the audience faders up and down relative to what's happening in the room. That can be a good way to kind of balance like the room response between worship versus when a pastor is speaking. Maybe they want like a lot more audience response and like, talk back to the pastor. So there's some simple ways, even with an X32, like this doesn't need to be a Digico and Waves or an SSL or like some big complicated thing. There's still ways to do this really easily and effectively, which cues up a really good promotion for an upcoming thing. as I am kind of getting situated into this new house here, I'm going to be working on developing more content that's like practical application for people. And a lot of that is going to be shooting some content to be able to showcase, hey, here's some simple, just best practices that I found that work well, kind of like what I'm talking about with the matrices. So stay tuned on that. We'll kind of discuss some of that at the end of ways to keep in touch. But there's some like good practical content that I'll be creating here in the near future. That is going to be hopefully a good resource for you guys to use that can kind of dive deeper into some like real world applications of some of this stuff, so that it's not just kind of talking about it, in practice. So
yeah, my approach to that actually sometimes is if you can, it's always best to have a separate online mix, because sometimes there's already a lot going on in the room. Like there's a lot for you to, especially when you're mixing front of house, there's a lot you need to worry about, loudness in the room, like real-time mixing, trying to blend the instruments, blend the vocals, and just being dynamic. So if you can take the burden of online off your chest as a front of house engineer, please.
Exactly.
Do. And also, what makes a good online mix? Yeah.
So, to me, objectively, I think that clarity and like balance is probably the biggest things that I would be looking for. Something that I've worked on with some churches in the past has been like either the vocals are so far forward that there's no balance to the musicianship that's happening. And then I've also seen the other direction where the vocals are so buried that all you hear is drums and bass, and it doesn't feel like it's a cohesive, blend of everything. And I think that's where if the vision is for it to be more like album quality, like having a separate console or a separate platform to mix in can be really beneficial to getting dynamics control and, those kind of things. But I think clarity and balance in the mix, even just balance in like the worship being at a good volume and then the speaking not being like buried way quieter than that. And that's where some of that conversation of like, if you don't have a separate mix set up and you're literally taking the exact same like bus, your main left right from a front of house mix and sending it, where your worship volume is versus your speaking volume is probably going to be a little bit lower in the room. And then when you go play that back in a car or on a phone or a TV, it feels like the pastor's just like way quiet and lost.
Yes.
So again, driving some things on a matrix, there's ways to kind of compensate and balance that out better. But yeah, I think those are my two biggest things would probably be just clarity and balance. Like, can you hear separation between the different instruments? Like, if there's a rhythm guitar and a lead guitar, is the rhythm guitar like the only one that's heard and the lead guitar is just somewhere floating? Or can you actually hear both of them? And that gets into like panning and, different things. Which again, back to our conversation, like if hearing a really big wide spread of all the instruments and vocals being panned out and stuff, like some of those things might be harder to accomplish with just taking the mix into a matrix versus having a separate console or other processing where you're able to address those needs differently.
So to my next question about online audio, how do you achieve a consistent audio level both during music and during speech? Because what happens most time is during music you have a good level. Then when the pastor starts speaking, especially for pastors that speaks quietly, like the level just drops, and people online struggle to hear the preaching. For pastors, especially for pastors that preaches really quietly. So how do you ensure a consistent audio level through the service, both for speech and music?
Yeah, totally. So I can give you a couple practical examples of what I'm doing with my church right now. Like one of the things that I'm looking at for loudness is there's a free to try DAW called Reaper. I think it's $50 to buy a license, so it's a lot more affordable than like Pro Tools or Logic to get into. So we use that for some recording things, but the other thing that's really cool is it has a built-in LUFS meter that's like a free plugin that just comes with the DAW. And so I'm actually using that to monitor what our video loudness is, and it's kind of setting and dialed now, but when we were first opening the building, we were looking at that a lot to make sure that we were like where our actual loudness was, which that kind of gets me into a different part of the answer, which would be a big thing that I try to help people with is making sure that what is the mix that is leaving your console, whatever volume you have that it's actually translating to video well. The biggest thing probably that I've noticed going in to look at different systems is either there's like automatic gain that might be happening if it's like coming in on a Focusrite or in the Blackmagic software, something like that's basically over compressing or over limiting something instead of letting some of the natural dynamics be there. So you would think that would help, but sometimes it makes it more of a problem than it needs to be. The other thing is just using an actual audio embedder. I'm wearing my headphones. I can't reach over here and get one, but Blackmagic, AHA, or AJA, a couple other companies make a audio to SDI embedder or audio to HDMI, depending on what your video platform is. And so whether it's analog or if it's, especially if you're able to drive like AES or Dante or MADI, some digital format from your console into a video embedder means that there's no analog gain that's happening between when it leaves your console and when it hits the video system. And so what that ultimately ends up looking at is that when you're seeing that your LUFS is sitting at, let's say, -12 or -16, when it leaves the console, that's actually what it is when it hits the video feed. And so a lot of times I've been seeing stuff where either things are way louder than when they left the console, or the other direction, it's actually way quieter. And so you like don't really notice it during worship, and then pastor gets up to speak and it's like he's buried in the mix. But then the console operator will be like, well, it looks correct on this end. And so like, we're not throwing video under the bus. We have to work together with video team. But that's a simple investment. I mean, I think an SDI embedder from Blackmagic's like $160. This is not $1,000 piece of software or anything crazy. But the amount of places I've gone and seen where they're just taking XLRs direct into the switcher instead of using an SDI embedder and bringing audio in that way. So I know that's a very technical answer. In a real world application, just like good bus compression or having limiting, like will help control some of those peaks where he's, going from. But also like, I don't find, like I'm thinking about when we set up our broadcast mix originally for 2819, there wasn't a lot of the pastor hitting like the master bus limiter. It was all processing on his channel. Because our pastor has a very wide dynamic range. He'll get very quiet and then he'll get very loud. And so like, again, this is where like having a separate console or separate mix platform can be beneficial because you can stack processing. So like a practical example of that is there's usually 2 or 3 compressors happening on a pastor chain for me. So there might be like, we could deep dive this another time, but basically a fast compressor with fast attack and fast release that's grabbing like quick transient moments, a slow attack and release compressor that's kind of gluing together and making up some volume, and then that feeds into a pastor bus or a group, and that has another compressor and or a limiter on it. And so like, I just know because I've had to set this up enough times, our pack for our pastors at -12, it comes in digitally at -2, so there's basically -14 dB of trim so that when he's full tilt, it's not gonna clip. And then through the console, there's 22 dB of makeup gain to get it back to where it needs to. But then that allows me to know that when I have the fader at 0, he's actually at the correct volume where he needs to be. So I think that's a complicated answer, but like more than just, hey, you should try this plugin or you should try this thing. Usually the biggest thing that I'm pushing people towards is, are you actually embedding the audio in a good manner into your video system? Because if you're just running out of your console into the XLR inputs on a switcher or something like that, like there are ways to calibrate that, but I've just had that burn me more often than not, or if the software settings get changed or something, versus using a dedicated embedder to bring the audio in. So that's given me consistency and better results because I know that whenever it leaves the console and it hits the embedder, that's actually what's going to the live stream. Sorry, I know that was a long-winded answer, but.
All right, good. So I will just go straight to the monitor mixing session. For monitor mixing for churches, I think one of the most important thing is having a very good cordial relationship with the band as a sound engineer. Because
100%.
the way I preach this is, you as a sound engineer, you are like you're providing service, and your service is not just for yourself. Your service is for your pastor, who is the stakeholder, and the musicians, who are like the end users of the product. So you need to relate with them like your service users, and try to understand what they want. Understand, because the problem with a lot of musicians sometimes is they don't even know what they want, and that's totally fine.
Right. Well, that tees up a good question. I'm going to kick this one over to you, and then I can kind of give a response to it. But do you find in the churches that you're working with, do you find that personal monitor mixers like an Aviom or a Roland, are those kind of a better platform to get musicians going, or do you find having a separate monitor engineer lands a better result? What has your experience been?
Yeah, based on my experience, I think having a personal mixing is much better for musicians. Because one thing you should know about musicians, sometimes musicians are very difficult to satisfy. And I know you're a musician yourself, so you sometimes you just want your sound in a particular way, and the mix might be good, it might not just be your preference. So even if you have a very good sound engineer, you might still not be totally happy with the result. So sometimes musicians are very, very difficult to satisfy. So a very good way to have that middle ground is giving them a personal mixing system, so that way they can be able to tweak the sound and shape the sound based on their preference, and that would reduce the effect of not taking responsibility from their part. Because another thing musicians likes to do is, I'm sorry for musicians in this chat, another thing musicians like to do is they don't like to take responsibility. They blame everyone else for themselves but themselves. So it's very easy to say the sound engineer doesn't know what he's doing. It's very easy to say the sound engineer spoiled but then they don't know their own contribution to what is causing the sound to be terrible. So musicians actually don't have discipline in terms of managing volume and velocity and some of the things like that. Some don't even come for sound check.
Whoa, bringing powerful words here. Yeah, showing up practiced for sound check.
Yeah,
that's important.
Yeah, some don't even come for sound check. They'll just come when the service has started.
I've never seen that happen.
Yeah, that happens a lot.
Never happened.
That happens a lot.
Yeah. So, do you think? Have you ever done anything with a hybrid approach where, you might have a monitor engineer with a console that is feeding stuff to the musicians, but the monitor engineer is responsible just for the vocal mixes?
I think, even for that, there are ways you can manage that. Sometimes you can have some of the wireless in-ear monitors to set in a focus mode, where you can have your vocals on a channel and have your instruments on another channel. And sometimes you can have the monitor mixing engineer mixing, then sending the output of what is mixing into the separate input of the personal mixer, like the ME, Axiom, and other things like that. But I think most important is giving them the liberty to be able to shape their sound. So that way, they don't really put too much, expectation on the sound engineer, because they know they have the ability to adjust the sound based on their preference.
Well, and that brings another. I don't want to open a can of worms here, but something that I've worked towards with a couple of the churches that I've been on staff with is getting, within reason, getting in-ear consistent, the actual ear drivers consistency. And so especially for, not everybody is going to have the budget or the ability to do molded ears. I don't even own molded ears. I have a couple universals that I like, that I use, and they're not $40 universals, but even in the $40 range, or I usually say to people hey, if you can get into $80, $100, that's so much better of an experience than an $18 set of in-ears. And yes, I know KZ has ears for $18, and they work, they make noise. But where I'm going with this is, if you have a monitor engineer or even if you don't and you're driving monitors from front of house, because I know there's a lot of people that's just kind of the reality based on the budget or just the size of the room. Maybe there's not even a room to put a monitor mixer side stage, so everything has to be done from front of house, which is fine. But something that I have encouraged some production teams to do is like, hey, especially for your primary musicians. So let's say your lead vocal worship leader, or your worship pastor, and then whoever your primary musician is. So maybe if it's a keys, like the music director, or maybe the music director is the bassist, or a drummer or whatever, but like getting a couple of your main critical musicians and vocalists, if they don't have their own molded ears or whatever, everyone else just having the church invest in buying 5, 6, 8 pairs of the same in-ear, whether it's a $40 or $100 or a $300, but like the speed that you'll gain for everybody being able to hear consistently the same frequency response is something that I don't really see a lot of people talking about. But for a front of house guy to be able to plug their ears into the console and listen to a vocalist mix and then be able to hear it on the same in-ears and the same frequency response that the vocalist is hearing is huge. Like that's a mind-blowing concept to some people, but that's a really simple, easy, effective thing to implement, especially for, like, again, maybe in your church, your worship pastor has molded ears, or they've got like some universal, universal audio or some other thing that are like a high-end, good quality set of ears, but all of your background vocalists don't. Hey, if they're serving and they've been on the team for more than 2 months, maybe for those 6 people, invest $80 into getting them a good set of universal ears that your monitor person or your front of house person can also have the same set. And that way, when they're trying to talk about, I need this up or I need this down, it's like, well, if the ears that they're using have no low end response, talking to some bassists, then you're going to just be sitting here turning up bass all day, and you're going to just crush all of the headroom in the mix because they're trying to hear their bass or feel their bass. It's like, well, the issue was never the mix. The issue was the ears that they were using couldn't even replicate the low end that you're trying to send to them, versus having something that is going to be able to be more universal and kind of a flatter response that works for everyone. So anyways, I got off on a tangent there, but that's a simple, like, practical way to help create some consistency for musicians or vocals, especially if you are not doing a personal mixer and you have to do monitors from front of house. But yeah, I mean, as a drummer and a guitarist myself, I like having a personal mixer. I also like having a monitor engineer with like talkback mics and stuff on stage. But
sometimes,
a lot of times,
when you're playing, you just want to focus on playing rather than communicating with the engineer.
Right. No, 100%. I think that cues in the thing of like, sometimes it's easier and it's more practical for like it can sometimes be easier for a monitor engineer to service the needs of the musicians while they're playing, instead of trying to tweak the mixer, keep playing, tweak the mixer. And like, if you don't have a midweek rehearsal where you can take the time to actually set all that stuff, if you have people who are traveling, maybe more than 10, 15, 20 minutes away, if somebody has to drive an hour to service, maybe they're not able to make a midweek rehearsal. And so like having somebody mixing their ears actively during sound check could be more beneficial than them trying to figure all of it out on a personal mixer. So I don't know. I think there's a use case for both of them. And then I think you could also you could split the in-between on the line of this, where there's a lot of consoles that have a good iPad app or iPhone app. And I've been to a lot of places where they're just not using that because they don't have a good Wi-Fi router set up or something. But like, that's kind of my preference a lot of times. Again, as long as the network works and it's reliable. But like, as a drummer and an audio engineer, I just want to be able to control my mix on stage, but I want the power of the processing on the console instead of the sound of the Aviom or whatever. But that's just because
when we're talking about reliability, I don't think iPad is much reliable as mixing system like the Axiom MU ones and P systems.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, you have to deal with the Wi-Fi thing. Although I have seen some people combat that by using a Ethernet USB-C adapter on the iPad so that they can run it wired on a network switch. So there are ways to do it where you don't have to rely on Wi-Fi. Maybe somebody will take that idea and run with it. But yeah, there's always ways to.
And another trick I always advocate for is it's better to run what you're sending to your personal mixing system. It's better to run it after your effects. The same way you have your pre-fader, post-fader, and things like that, pre-EQ or like direct outputs. It's better for you to probably pick your send from, because the way I do is I try to use my subgroup to send to my P16s. So that way I have all the processing on my individual channel, and I also have all the processing on my subgroups, because for my mixing desk I use subgroups. I love mixing with subgroups. So I have subgroups for drums, subgroup for BVs, subgroup for toms, separate subgroup. So it's easy for me to mix, and instead of mixing with DC, I get to mix with subgroup Lomo.
Yep.
And I send my subgroup processing to my P16, and that way what the musicians are hearing is not raw. So they are hearing the processing, and sometimes it helps them to enjoy and have a better feel of the monitor mixing as well.
Yeah, I will say though, a thing to be careful with, because I agree with that, but I've also had that burn me. Something that can be problematic is, and this gets back to a way earlier conversation about system design, if you have a lot of low end in your PA, for example, like too much low end, and you end up high passing things a lot and cutting a lot of low end out, if you're sending that really cut down signal to a subgroup and then sending that to monitors, they're going to just keep sending low end from their piano patch or their guitar patch or whatever, thinking that it doesn't sound full. So I think there's a balance. What I do like about using subgroups, like you're saying, is if you're doing, especially in the sense if you're doing monitors from front of house, something that can be beneficial is like, instead of chasing, let's say you have 8 vocals. Okay, if you have a BGVs bus and all of those are there, being able to send the BGV group or bus to the musicians for their ears instead of all 8 individual mics and trying to keep up with the volume riding and everything, like it can be a lot easier just like, okay, here's your worship leader and then here's all the rest of the vocals, and that way they're just getting the final polished mix from the BGV subgroup. So yeah, I think that's a great way to approach stuff like that. And a lot of times I'll even split it to where, like, if your console has the ability, I know this is getting kind of past just an X32 capacity, but maybe if you're on an SQ or an Avantis or something, or some other consoles, I think CL5 can do this, you can set the aux send pick point pre or post the EQ based on the aux instead of a global setting. So for example, I would take the electric channel to the guitarist and send it pre-EQ, so they're hearing their system flat, but then I would send it post-EQ to the rest of the musicians, because trying to make room for everything in everyone's ear mix, again, there's a right and wrong way to approach this, but like sometimes those are some things that can help bring some like room to everyone. Is, hey, if the guitarist has good in-ears and they want to be able to hear like truly what's happening, let them fix the tone at the source and just give them their channel flat. But everyone else might need some high mids taken out or some low end taken out to make room for it for a keys mix or a vocal mix or whatever. So those are some ways that you can address like getting clarity in an in-ear mix without having to double patch all of your channels or, kind of overcomplicating it. So what do you think is a good way to, or some points to like manage working with difficult musicians? Like, is it like, have you found working with musicians that like, if you can just get some like personal one-on-one time, maybe go grab coffee or food with them and just like get to know them better? I've always felt like it's a relational equity. If it becomes, especially for church, like touring is a completely different thing. They're there to put on a show. But in the church environment, like if you can remove some of the ego barriers and stuff and be like, hey, I want you to sound good. And these are things that I'm hearing from my seat at front of house or even in a broadcast mix, anyways, do you have any kind of thoughts on just talking through working with musicians and trying to get like the best out of them?
Yeah. So the secret with working with musicians, especially or why mixing monitors for musicians, is you need to like deal with them like okay. So this is the way I approach it. I see musicians as sorry to use the word, like people who likes attention sometimes. So um from that perspective, I don't deal with them with ego. Like when dealing with musicians, you need to put your ego aside. You need to put your technical knowledge aside, and you need to like relate with them based on what's on your mind. Let me listen to you. Let me validate your feeling. Then I would give you what is practical. So doing that, sometimes you might need to develop a very like a solid relationship with them. You know, just not about mixing, like understand the kind of person you're dealing with. Because most important thing is you need to understand the kind of person the let's say the particular musician is. So your understanding of the musician would help you to relate with them. Because let's say some musicians actually likes like attention. So as a result of that, they keeps, poking you, asking for what's not realistic, asking,
Right.
what do you have on my channel? Is there EQ on my guitar? Is there like compression? Is there gate? Do you have reverb? So sometimes they just want attention. Not necessarily because anything is wrong with your mix. So
Yeah.
people like that, you need to validate them, and that because I always say
Yeah.
they are our service users.
Right.
So you need to
There's
validate
a
them. You need to give
I
them a bit of attention. And some people also like they are just very difficult to work with. So people like that also you need to like communicate with them on their frequency, like respectfully. But most important thing is you have to be very respectful. You also have to like let them know you want their best interest. Let them know like you are there to serve them. So then they will listen to you better as well.
Right. I can't take credit for this. I've said this, but I got this from a mentor of mine years ago. But I'm paraphrasing. But basically, what he was getting at is, if you can build the relationship with musicians, offstage equity brings on stage clarity. Offstage equity brings on stage clarity. If you're finding like you're butting heads with your drummer, you have to be the bigger person maybe as an audio engineer to go, hey, I'm struggling with X. Maybe their snare tuning is too low. It's never happened in church. Or the other direction, maybe the snare tuning is way too high. And it's like, hey, maybe instead of adding all this EQ and processing trying to make the snare drum thicker, it's like, okay, maybe go talk to your worship pastor. Does the sound that they're giving you match what the vision and culture of the worship is supposed to sound like? And maybe a metal snare drum sound isn't the right thing for Bethel worship.
Can I ask you a quick question? How do you develop
Yeah.
trust with the musicians that you work with?
So it's a great question. I'll need to answer this two different ways. Personally, for me,
Yeah.
because I'm a musician,
Yeah.
whenever I've gotten to have the conversation, like just asking them like, oh dude, what's on your pedal board? Or, oh dude, I really like that snare and the tuning. Or, hey, how's that head working for you on the toms? Do you feel like that's giving you the warmth that you're looking for instead of like those kinds of things? I think sometimes maybe quicker build that relational equity with musicians because I'm a musician, and I was a musician before being an audio engineer. So the shirt has always been I'm a musician masquerading as a front of house engineer because I'd really rather play the drums. That's not true, but I'm always happy behind the kit or behind the guitar. So like for me personally, I feel like that's just always been easier because I play a lot of the instruments, and that also kind of helps me to understand like how to talk in the same language with them of like, hey, you're trying to make this part cut through on a bridge that's building or on an intro part, and I'm not getting the clarity that I need in the mix for this to cut through. Could you try going and playing that part with the bridge pickup instead of the neck pickup? It wasn't even like changing a distortion pedal or changing their patch or anything. It was just what they're doing with their instrument. But you can't just tell them on the mic and be like, hey, that doesn't work, use your bridge pickup. Like that's not going to be received well. But if you were talking with them, like maybe between the rehearsal and before the service starts, and you were like, hey, I really like the part you're playing, but it doesn't sound as clear as I'm hoping out here. What do you think about maybe playing it on the bridge pickup so that there's more clarity in the tone that's coming? Because it sounds like the neck pickup is like a lot thicker and chunkier, and it's just kind of getting lost in all of the instrumentation in the mix. That's probably going to be received better than just like, hey, your patch isn't good, you need to make your patch better. I was like, well, maybe there's nothing wrong with the patch. It was just kind of the way that they were playing that part or something. And I think also just like, you can also bridge that gap easier if you're, as an audio engineer, at the end of the day, you're trying to take all of these sources that are coming to you from the stage and present them in a cohesive manner that sounds like a good mix for worship, right? And so you can achieve that better if you understand like good references of what that stuff's supposed to sound like, whether it's your favorite worship albums or, those kind of things. And a quick example of that be, I love watching the guitar or drum tutorial videos from like an Elevation Worship or Bethel or whatever, because you can hear their musicians in a much more isolated mix playing the guitar part and hear how it's actually supposed to sound from the record. And then when you go listen to it with your local musicians that are playing it, then you can be like, okay, hey, could you give me more reverb, because I'm not hearing enough of it in the mix and it feels like it could be like more airy and kind of ethereal sounding versus maybe it was too dry from the way they were playing it. But you would never know that if you don't even have the context of what it might supposed to sound like. So anyways, I think like you can also build relational equity with your musicians if you're willing to put the time in to learn a little bit more about their instrument, like learning, like for example, if you have a Nord piano, I don't see people utilizing this a lot, but like it has 4 outputs. You can send the organ and the pads down outputs 3, 4, and then you can send the piano down the 1, 2 output, and now you have 2 stereo channels that you can blend between the piano and the pad element and just let them play, and you can balance it for the room in the moment for what makes sense in worship, instead of trying to have them fidget with it the whole time to balance everything. There's Yamahas can do that. There's other pianos. I'm just using the Nord as an example. But like as an audio engineer, like, do you even know that their instrument can do that if they've not already set that up? So I think you can build that relational equity when you're willing to put some of the legwork in. You can't expect everyone to just, bow down and give you everything perfect. Like, you have to meet them halfway, right? So anyways, I hope that was a long-winded answer, but I hope that kind of makes sense.
Yeah, so most important thing is communication. So
you want to talk a little bit about like what elements you would say kind of at a starting point help establish a good monitor mix? Because like I know I deal with a lot of people where they just want to have this like massive studio album sounding in-ear mix, and it's like, hey man, you're sitting on top of a wall of subs, like you're never gonna get that. Like, let's try to pull some stuff down and make this more like, what do you actually need to hear? Like, it's probably not gonna sound like a broadcast mix without a lot more budget and resources.
Okay, so for monitor mixing, I think there are 3 things that are very important, and one of it is the vocals. Then aside the vocals, you need something that would help you as a vocalist to stay on key.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, pitch reference.
Yes, so vocals, reference, and rhythm.
Mm-hmm.
So rhythm is probably something that will help you to stay on time. So that might be the tracks, that might be the stems, that might probably be the kick and snare. Then the reference can also be like the keys, the guitars, or the pads, and the vocals. So while mixing for like a vocalist, even though like people have preference, but there are like basic things you need to like put in place, even without asking, which is they need to hear themselves. They need some elements that would help them stay in key, like let's say the piano, the bass, depending, and timing as well. Mm-hmm. So they need element of timing. That might be click, just the click. Some people just want just the click.
Right.
So those are the 3 elements you should pay attention. Rhythm. The rhythm might be the kick and snare. It might be the click. It might also be like a percussion, mm-hmm. based on the depending on the music arrangement. Then also like reference for music can be the guitar or the keyboard, and then the vocals. Then for mixing for individual like musicians, I think one most important thing is communication. So before your event or before your service, if possible, have conversations with your musicians. What would you like to hear in your
Yeah,
your
what are the
monitors.
priority elements?
Yeah, what are the priority elements in your monitors? Then have that feedback. Then you can now like structure their mix based on their preference or based on their priority elements. Because trust me, some musicians are very weird. I've worked with a musician that said, I don't want to hear anything, just my voice and what's it called? The keys. Like I don't want anything in my.
But sometimes those people are the best performers and the best vocalists because they're not being drowned out by 30 other inputs of stuff.
Yes, but funny enough, some musicians also want, they want everything in their ears. So it's just uh, depending on individual preference.
Yeah, I mean, I'll use our violinist as a great example. Like, her whole thing is she's like, I don't want to hear the drums, I don't want to hear the pad. There's a lot of stuff pulled out of it, but she has probably one of the best sounding ear mixes because everything's not competing for space inside of these tiny little eardrums. And again, we're taking this in context of a medium-sized church. Like, yes, people can have amazing sounding ear mixes when you're on a massive console with a midweek rehearsal and all of these like pristine inputs, and that also comes from budget and vision. So like, we're not gonna say that you can't get there. And I've also had great mixes with small consoles with a low input count, but we're gonna make a generalization here of like maybe mostly volunteer musicians, volunteer engineers. Maybe you don't have a 4-hour rehearsal during the middle of the week and you just have an hour sound check and then you do 2 services. And like, that's not unnormal. I feel like that's the reality for most people. We're blessed that we get to have a midweek rehearsal, but like the church I was at previously, we never had a midweek rehearsal. And so we had a very short amount of time on Sundays to try to get everything right. And there had to be some reality expectations with like, hey, we can't keep chasing the snare bottom microphone up and down 1 dB. Like, just turn it down a dB and just be okay with it. Like, I'm not calling anyone out. But anyways, what do you think? Do you think it's a big importance for musicians to get a grasp of the basics of sound so that they can communicate with their engineer? Like, I know a big thing I always try to communicate to people is like, if you're talking as an engineer, don't try to be using like technical terms. So there's I don't have it with me. There's an image called I think it's like the 10 dwarfs or the 10 elves of sound, but it's like, muddy and boxy and boomy or thumpy or harsh or sibilant or brash. And even sibilant is like, well, I'm like, okay, that's sound. Like, sometimes you just have to demonstrate what certain stuff sounds like. Or if you're like, hey, does your guitar sound like this? Instead of it sounding really, but like using more generalized terms, because probably 90% of the keyboard players aren't going to know that they want to have a cut at 400 hertz because it's boxy. But if you're like, hey, does your piano sound a little bit honky in the ears, or does it sound good to you? And maybe because of the balance of everything in their ears, because they have bass guitar and vocals and stuff, they might need a lot of that mid-range for the resonance and the pitch element of what they're playing, and not as much of the 2K or the 100 hertz. And so like what this gets back to your earlier point of, you're serving the musician and their ear needs, not what you think sounds correct. And even if it doesn't maybe sound the way you want it to, if it's correct to them, that should be the primary goal. Now, I think there's a balance to if it's just bad, but objectively, we're talking that we're trying to serve what they need to hear for their mix to be good. But anyways, you think it's important for musicians to kind of have a general understanding of this.
I always encourage musicians to learn the basics of sound. One, it helps you to know what you want with your sound. And 2, it also helps you communicate with the sound engineer better. Because it's going to be like much more difficult for a sound engineer to serve you right if they don't like understand your language. Like let's say like musician is coming to you and it's just like my in-ear is sounding like trash. I mean, that's not you get, but it's okay if you come and be like I think what's it called? Every other thing is too loud in my ears, or can I like just have less of myself. Or I need a cut of high pass filter on my like piano. So things like that, helps the sound engineer to like give you a precise like solution rather than just trying to attend to you based on what they think you need or what they think you're saying.
Right.
So when you give specific terms, it helps to give specific like just straightforward answer to your request.
I think that also tees up another point with monitoring is like the conversation of moving from wedges to in-ears. Especially like I don't even say just because of where we're at currently in the advancements of technology, but just especially in the whole like competing with feedback and stage bleed. I remember I went to a church a couple months back and they were using a lot of monitors and like, this is feeding back and this is feeding back. And I just had to sit down with them. I was like, hey guys, based on your room and the size of the room, which was pretty small, and I was like, there's really no world where this is going to be a win. This is not like a tuning thing or a processing thing or whatever. You just have so much volume on your stage that you're outrunning the PA. And so like, forget making it not even a good consistent experience for the people in the front couple rows, but there's so much volume and competing volume on stage that you're never going to be able to hear anything with clarity. And I know a lot of people will go, oh, I don't want to do in-ears because it feels isolated. I'm like, great, let's talk about putting a few room mics in, or audience mics on the front lip of the stage. Or I've even seen people, if it's a big enough room, like if they have a lighting truss, they'll put audience mics up on the lighting truss because it gets it away and up from the sound or away from the PA bleed and everything. And so like there's ways to be able to address the isolation part of it where it doesn't feel like it's just sitting in a black hole with your mix. But that's been a big thing I feel like for me in the last couple of years is like, hey, how do we make your in-ear experience great where it's not just a drowning void of, well, I put my ears in and then I pull my ears out and everything feels great, but I still can't hear anything. And like we have some wedges on the front of our stage, and it's mostly actually there for pastor to hear the vocals. It's not actually for our vocalists. But it was a good point of it was like, hey, when I come up and we're transitioning from worship to the message, he couldn't really tell where they were at because our PA has been deployed well where there's not a lot of bleed on stage. And so the vocals are great in the room, but he couldn't hear them or know where they were at in the song or anything. And so we have some monitors. We've got wedges on the front edge of the stage, but they're only there for pastor. The only thing that's in them is the piano and the vocals. And actually, to your point of like subgroups, that's actually how I'm driving the monitors from front of house on an aux, and they're fed from my vocal and my keys group instead of being a pre-fade thing, so that when I start pulling them down in the mix, they automatically disappear in the monitors, and there's never like an open mic that can squeal in the floor monitors because it's automatically been pulled down when they start walking off stage. And so we for our church, we split the responsibility because that's the only wedge monitor we have. And so I'm driving that mix from front of house, and then the monitor engineer handles all of the in-ear in-ear mixes. So anyways, we've got another section here. We're kind of coming up to about an hour. So we're going to try to get through this, last section here, and then we're going to open this up for Q&A.